At 68 years old, Nora Vance stood on a damp sidewalk and watched her world disappear into the back of a white moving truck. But what her son Marcus didn't know, what he was far too arrogant to even consider, was that some legacies are written in stone and steel, rather than ink and paper. The rusted iron key he had pressed into her palm wasn't a consolation prize for a woman he considered a burden. It was an invitation to a miracle that would soon set the entire city talking. If you've ever felt the cold sting of a loved one's betrayal, if you've been discarded by the very people you spent your life protecting, if you've stood in the rain wondering how a lifetime of work could result in a single suitcase, this story is for you. Subscribe to the channel right now. You cannot afford to leave this story. The ending is something no one saw coming. Nora adjusted the weight of the heavy canvas bag on her shoulder. The strap dug into her skin through the fabric of her thin wool coat. She watched a mover carry out the blue velvet armchair where she had read Marcus' bedtime stories for 1,000 nights. The man handled it roughly. He didn't know the springs were loose. He didn't know a small wooden soldier was still wedged deep in the cushions. Marcus stood by his silver sedan and looked at his phone. He didn't look at the truck. He didn't look at the house where he had grown up. He didn't look at his mother. He had spent the last hour checking his watch and pacing the kitchen. He had used words like efficiency and transition. He told her the pumping station was a fair trade for the house. He said it would be quiet there. Nora looked at her hands. They were thin, and the veins showed through the skin like a map of a long journey. She had spent 40 years working double shifts at the city records office. She had started as a junior clerk. She ended as the woman who knew where every pipe and wire in the city was buried. She had skipped every vacation for a decade to pay for Marcus's law school. When he graduated, she had sold her mother's engagement ring to pay for his first office lease. She told him she had found a forgotten savings bond. She had worked through the pneumonia of '92 because the office was short-staffed. She needed the overtime pay for his wedding. She never mentioned the fever. She never mentioned the coughing fits. She simply smoothed her skirt and went to work. The neighbor across the street, Mrs. Gable, stood behind her screen door. She didn't wave. The silence of the neighborhood felt like a heavy blanket soaked in gray water. Nora reached into her pocket and felt the cold, notched edge of her father's brass master key. It was a heavy thing. It felt solid against her shaking fingers. Her father had been the city's chief engineer. He had given her the key on his deathbed. He told her it would always lead her home. Marcus finally looked up from his screen. He gave a short, sharp nod. It was the kind of gesture a man gives to a stranger. He got into his car and drove away without a second glance. The moving truck followed him. The sound of the engines faded. Only the wind in the maple trees remained. Nora turned her back on the house she had called home for 40 years. She began to walk toward the bus stop at the corner. Her shoes were sensible and flat. They made a rhythmic clicking sound on the pavement. She felt the brass key through the fabric of her coat. It was warm now. It had absorbed her body heat. It felt like a small, living thing, resting against her heart. She didn't know where she would sleep. She didn't know what she would eat. But she was still Nora Vance. She was still her father's daughter. She kept walking. Nora Vance was 68 years old when she realized that a mother's memory is often a one-way street. She sat on the hard plastic bench of the bus stop and felt the vibration of the city beneath her feet. It was a low, industrial hum that most people ignored. But Nora had spent 4 decades in the basement of the city records office. She knew that hum was the sound of 1,000 valves and 1,000,000 gallons of water moving through the earth. She knew the city's secrets because she had filed them all away in grey metal cabinets. She remembered the morning Marcus was born. It had been a Tuesday in late August. She had looked at his small red face and promised him the world. She had kept that promise at the expense of her own. When he was 10, she started taking the late shifts at the archives to save for a college fund he didn't even know existed. She spent her nights in a room that smelled of old paper and damp concrete. She catalogued the blueprints of a city that was growing too fast to remember its own bones. When Marcus needed his bar exam prep courses, she quietly cancelled her own retirement contributions. She told him the city had offered a special scholarship for children of employees. She took a second job in the hospital laundry to cover the closing costs on his first suburban home. She spent her nights folding hot sheets until her knuckles were raw and bleeding. When his first marriage failed, she sold her only car to pay for the private investigators and the high-priced lawyers. She told him she preferred the bus. She said the walking was good for her heart. She walked 3 miles to work in the winter slush. She never complained about the cold. She never mentioned the dampness that seeped into her boots. For 30 years, her morning ritual had been the same. She would wake at 5. She would put the blue enameled kettle on the stove. She would listen for the whistle. That kettle was the only thing she had left from her own mother. It was chipped at the spout, and the handle was loose. But it made a sound that felt like safety. On the morning of the eviction, Marcus had moved the kettle to the discard pile. He said it was an eyesore. He said a modern kitchen didn't need a rusted relic. He didn't see her hand shake when she picked it up and tucked it into her suitcase. She had trusted Marcus because he was her son. She believed him when he said the suburban house was too much for her to manage alone. He had smiled that practiced, legal smile. He told her she was moving to a historic property by the river. He called it a retreat. He said it was a place where she could finally rest. He didn't tell her it was a decommissioned pumping station from 1912. He didn't tell her the windows were boarded up with rotted plywood. The bus arrived with a hiss of air brakes. A small dog with wiry grey fur and one tattered ear sat by the bench. His name was Barnaby. He belonged to a neighbour who had moved away 2 weeks prior. No one had come back for him. He looked at Nora with eyes the colour of old pennies. He didn't bark. He didn't beg. He simply stood up and waited. When Nora stepped onto the bus, the dog followed her. The driver started to protest, but he looked at Nora's face and went silent. Nora sat near the back. She opened her hand and looked at the brass key. It was a heavy, notched thing on a frayed leather lanyard. Her father, Arthur, had been the city's chief engineer. He had carried this key for 40 years. He told her it was the master of the grid. He said that power wasn't something you owned. Power was something you maintained. He had given it to her on his deathbed in a hospital room that smelled of bleach and lilies. He had whispered that the station was her inheritance. He told her to listen to the water. At the time, she hadn't understood. She had been too busy raising Marcus. She had been too busy making sure her son never had to know the smell of a damp basement. She had forgotten about the station until the lawyers handed her the deed. The deed Marcus had insisted she sign over to a holding company he controlled. He told her it was for tax purposes. He told her he was protecting her. The bus moved away from the suburbs. The manicured lawns and white fences disappeared. They were replaced by rusted warehouses and empty lots. Nora watched her reflection in the glass. She looked like a woman who had been erased. Her skin was the color of parchment. Her coat was a decade out of style. But her eyes were still sharp. They were the eyes of a clerk who could find a single misplaced document in a room of 10,000. She checked her purse. She had $42.87. It was not enough for a hotel. It was not enough for a deposit on an apartment. It was exactly enough for a bag of dog food and a box of tea. She felt Barnaby rest his head on her shoe. The dog was warm. He was the only thing in the world that wasn't moving away from her. She didn't look back at the suburban skyline. She looked at the river. The water was dark and moving fast. It was headed toward the edge of the city. It was headed toward the place where the maps ended. Nora Vance gripped the brass key until the metal bit into her palm. She was 68 years old, and she was starting over. At 68 years old, Nora Vance sat at the oak dining table she had polished every Sunday for 30 years. The kitchen was filled with the kind of harsh morning light that shows every scratch on the floor and every fray in the curtains. Marcus sat across from her. He wore a grey suit that cost more than Nora's first 3 cars combined. He didn't look at the framed photos of his own childhood on the wall behind her. He looked at the screen of his Apple Watch. "We're just being realistic, Mom," Marcus said. He pushed a stack of legal documents across the wood grain. "At your age, you simply can't manage a property of this size alone. The stairs are a liability. The taxes are rising. It's too much for one person to carry." Nora looked at the silver pen he had placed on top of the papers. It was heavy and cold. She remembered buying Marcus his first set of professional drafting pencils when he was in high school. She had worked 4 Saturday shifts at the city records office to afford the set with the leather case. Now, he was handing her a pen to sign away the roof she had kept over his head for decades. Claire sat next to him. She was Marcus's wife of 6 years. She spent the entire meeting scrolling through a real estate app on her phone. She didn't offer Nora a glass of water. She didn't ask how Nora's hip was feeling after the fall in the garden. She just tilted her phone screen toward Marcus. She showed him a photo of a modern glass house with a 3-car garage. "Dad would have wanted this," Marcus said. He leaned back in his chair. The wood creaked under his weight. "He always said we had to look toward the future. This is what's best for everyone involved." He didn't mention the $700,000 in equity sitting in the house. He didn't mention the developer who had already emailed him twice that morning about the lot size. He just smoothed his silk tie. He used his thumb to wipe a microscopic smudge of dust off the face of his watch. He looked at the door as if he were already halfway through it. "You're not getting nothing, Mom," Marcus added. His voice was smooth and practiced. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy, rusted brass key. He slid it across the table along with a single sheet of paper. "You're getting the pumping station. It's private. It's historic. It's what you always said you wanted, peace and quiet." He knew the station had been closed since the late 1950s. He knew the windows were boarded with rotted plywood. He knew the riverbank was overgrown with thorns and poison ivy. But he smiled at her with a look of manufactured concern. He spoke as if he were handing her the keys to a coastal villa instead of an industrial ruin. The 4-bedroom house to Marcus, the savings accounts to Marcus, the retirement fund to Marcus. While they exchanged a secret, victorious smile over the paperwork, Nora received what they called the legacy, a rusted iron key and a deed to a brick box. In the middle of a swamp. "You should have been more financially responsible, Mom," Marcus said quietly. He stood up and adjusted his jacket. "This is what happens when you live your whole life without thinking about the long game. You can't expect the world to just take care of you because you worked hard." He spoke as if she hadn't spent 40 years building the very foundation of his life. He spoke as if she hadn't sold her own mother's jewelry to pay for his law school textbooks. He picked up his leather briefcase and checked his watch one last time. He had a lunch meeting at a steakhouse downtown. He didn't have time for a long goodbye. "The movers will be here on Monday morning," Claire said. She finally looked up from her phone. She didn't look at Nora's eyes. She looked at the vintage porcelain clock on the kitchen wall. "Make sure you only pack what fits in the small suitcase. We don't want to clutter up the new place with old junk." Nora picked up the brass key. It was cold and smelled of old pennies. It felt like a lead weight in her palm. She didn't cry. She didn't scream at him. She didn't remind him of the nights she had stayed awake sewing his Halloween costumes. She knew that words were useless against a man who saw his own mother as a line item on a balance sheet. "I understand," Nora said. Marcus gave a short, sharp nod. It was the gesture of a businessman closing a deal with a minor vendor. He walked out the front door without looking back. Claire followed him, her heels clicking sharply on the hardwood. They didn't see Nora touch the surface of the oak table one last time. They didn't see her reach for the blue enameled kettle on the stove and tuck it into her bag. The door clicked shut. Nora stood on the corner of Elm and Main. She held a single suitcase with a plastic handle that bit into her palm. Barnaby sat at her feet. The dog's tail brushed the grey concrete in a slow, rhythmic sweep. He didn't look at the cars passing by. He looked up at Nora. She pulled her phone from her coat pocket. The screen was dark. She pressed the side button and the light flared. No missed calls. No new messages. The notification tray was empty. The last text in her history was 3 days old. It was an automated reminder from the pharmacy for a prescription she could no longer afford to fill. She opened her banking app. She watched the loading circle spin for 5 seconds. The balance appeared in small white numbers against a black background. She had $42.87 left in the world. She had $6 in cash tucked into the pocket of her Bible. That was the total. The math was simple. It wouldn't cover a motel room for a single night. It wouldn't cover a deposit on a studio apartment in the worst part of the city. It was exactly enough for a bag of dry dog food and a week of tea and bread. She looked at the empty screen of her phone again. She waited for the vibration of a text. She waited for Marcus to realize he had forgotten his mother. The silence was a physical weight. It was louder than the traffic. It was heavier than the suitcase. She put the phone back in her pocket and didn't check it again. She reached into her bag and felt the notched brass key. It was cold against her thumb. She remembered her father's hands. They were always stained with the smell of grease and copper. He had never promised her a mansion with a white fence. He had never spoken about equity or investment portfolios. He had spoken about the grid. He told her that the city had a heart made of iron and water. She looked at the bus schedule taped to the rusted pole. Route 14. It was the last line on the map. It went past the warehouses. It went past the scrap yards. It ended at the river where the pavement turned to gravel. "Come on, Barnaby," Nora whispered. The bus pulled up with a heavy hiss of air brakes. It smelled of diesel fumes and wet wool. The driver didn't look at her when she dropped her coins into the slot. He didn't ask where she was going with a suitcase and a stray dog. He just stared at the road ahead. Nora sat in the very back seat. She placed her suitcase on the floor between her knees. Barnaby crawled underneath the bench and rested his chin on her shoes. The city began to change outside the window. The bright storefronts disappeared. The glass towers were replaced by chain-link fences and boarded windows. She thought about the suburban house. She thought about the blue velvet chair Marcus was likely moving into his own study. She realized she didn't miss the chair. She didn't miss the polished oak table. She missed the person she had been when she believed her sacrifices meant something. She looked at the brass key in her hand. It was the only thing Marcus hadn't wanted. It was the only thing he hadn't known how to sell. She gripped the metal until it left a deep indentation in her skin. She didn't have a plan. She didn't have a backup. She only had a deed to a place the rest of the world had left for dead. The bus reached the end of the line. The driver opened the doors and waited. The only sound was the low idle of the engine. Nora stood up and lifted her suitcase. Her knees popped with the effort. Her lower back sent a sharp, hot needle of pain down her left leg. She stepped off the bus and onto the gravel. The driver closed the doors and turned the bus around. He drove away without looking back. Nora stood in the tall grass at the edge of the river. The wind smelled of mud and old iron. She was alone. Nora Vance, 68 years old, began to walk into a part of the map that the city had tried to forget. The gravel road eventually gave way to a dirt track hemmed in by towering stalks of hemlock and burdock. Her suitcase felt as though it were filled with lead weights rather than old sweaters and a chipped kettle. Every few yards, she had to switch the handle from her right hand to her left. Her shoulder was a knot of white-hot tension. Her left knee, the one she had injured falling on the icy city hall steps 3 winters ago, began to throb with a dull, insistent rhythm. Barnaby didn't stray. He stayed exactly 2 paces ahead of her. He stopped whenever she stopped. He waited in the tall, yellowed grass while she caught her breath. The air grew cooler as they approached the river. The sound of the water changed from a distant rush to a heavy, churning roar. She saw the building through a break in the trees. It sat on a low rise overlooking the bend in the river. It was a massive structure of dark Victorian brick. The chimney stack rose 60 feet into the grey sky like a warning finger. Marcus had called it a historic property. In the fading afternoon light, it looked like a tomb. The brickwork was choked with ivy as thick as a man's wrist. Most of the windows were covered with grey plywood that had begun to curl and rot at the edges. One window on the second floor remained uncovered. Its glass was jagged and black. The heavy iron door at the front was orange with rust. A pile of discarded tires sat in the weeds near the entrance. Nora stopped 10 feet from the door. She looked at the rotted wood and the rusted metal. She looked at the mud caked on her sensible shoes. For a moment, she didn't move. She thought about the bus stop. She thought about the $42.87 in her bank account. She thought about how easy it would be to just sit down in the dirt and wait for the cold to take her. Then Barnaby walked to the door. He didn't look at the tires or the rot. He sat down on the stone step and looked at the lock. He gave a single, sharp bark. Nora took a breath. She walked to a small building 100 yards down the path. It was a weather-beaten shack with a faded red awning and a sign in the window that read, "Live Bait and General Goods." 2 rusted gas pumps stood in front, their glass faces cracked and clouded. A pair of checkered curtains hung in the side window. A man in a grease-stained cap sat on a wooden crate out front. He was whittling a piece of cedar. He didn't look up as Nora approached, but he stopped his knife. "The bus only runs once a day this far out," the man said. His voice was like dry leaves on pavement. "I'm not looking for the bus," Nora said. She wiped a bead of sweat from her forehead. "I'm the new owner of the pumping station." The man stopped whittling. He looked at the heavy brass key hanging from the leather lanyard around Nora's neck. He looked at her work-worn hands and her tired eyes. He stood up slowly. His joints made a popping sound that mirrored Nora's own. "We've been waiting for you," the man said. "Arthur told us you'd come eventually." After he passed, he said to watch for the woman who carried the master of the grid. "I'm Ilias." "You knew my father?" Nora asked. "Everyone around here knew Arthur," Elias said. He pointed toward the brick building. He used to say the city was a body, and that place was the heart. He said, the heart never really stops. It just waits for the right person to find the beat again. Elias reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, sealed glass jar of heavy oil. He handed it to her. He didn't ask for money. You'll need that for the hinges, he said. The iron doesn't like to let go of what it's holding. Nora took the jar. The glass was warm from the sun. She walked back to the station. She stood before the heavy door. She saw a small detail she had missed before. Carved into the stone lintel above the door was a tiny, perfect ivy leaf. It was the exact same shape as the emblem on her father's brass key. She unscrewed the jar and poured the oil into the lock and across the hinges. She waited a full minute. She slid the brass key into the hole. It fit perfectly. She leaned her entire weight against the iron. The door didn't move at first. Then, with a sound like a low moan, the metal gave way. The smell of cold stone and ancient grease rushed out to meet her. It was the smell of her childhood. It was the smell of her father's coat. Nora stepped inside. The door echoed as it hit the interior wall. She was home. The interior of the station was a cathedral of shadow and cold grease. Nora clicked on her flashlight. The beam cut through dust so thick it looked like grey snow suspended in the air. Massive iron pipes, painted a faded industrial green, snaked along the walls like the ribs of a giant. She walked toward a small glass-walled office in the corner. Her knees felt like they were filled with broken glass. Every step sent a sharp, hot needle of pain through her lower back and into her hip. She reached the office and pushed the door. It was locked. She used the brass key. The bolt slid back with a heavy, satisfying thunk. Inside, she found a wooden desk and a single metal chair. She sat down immediately because her legs refused to hold her upright any longer. She put her head on the desk. The wood smelled of old tobacco and lemon oil. It was the smell of her father's Saturday mornings. She spent the next 3 hours cleaning a small circle of floor. She used a handful of rags she found in a locker and water from a rainwater barrel outside. She moved slowly. She had to stop every 10 minutes to let the throbbing in her hands subside. Her knuckles were swollen and red from the damp. She found a heavy canvas tarp in a storage closet. She dragged it to the office and folded it into a makeshift mattress. She placed her suitcase at the head of the tarp. She set the blue enameled kettle on the corner of the desk. It was the only bit of color in the grey room. Night fell quickly. A storm moved in from the river. The wind hammered against the boarded windows. Rain began to leak through the high roof. It made a rhythmic, hollow sound as it hit the iron pipes. Plink, plink, plink. Nora lay on the tarp and pulled her coat over her chest. Barnaby curled against her side. The dog was shivering. She looked at her phone. The screen was a bright, cruel square in the darkness. 0 missed calls, 0 messages. She thought, I cannot fix a leaky roof. I am 68 years old with $42.87, and I cannot fix a leaky roof. The math of the coming winter was too large to look at directly. She thought about the suburban house, with its central heating and its double-paned glass. She thought about Marcus sleeping in a room she had paid for. This is where I die. Not tonight, but this is where it ends. This is what dying alone looks like. She closed her eyes and waited for the cold to numb her mind. A heavy thud sounded at the outer door. Barnaby stood up and growled. Nora sat up, her heart hammering against her ribs. A tall man stood in the doorway of the office. He wore a heavy yellow slicker and carried a battery-powered lantern. He was a tall man with a carpenter's hands and very few words. He looked at the tarp on the floor. He looked at the blue kettle. You're Arthur's girl, the man said. I'm Nora, she whispered. I'm Silas, the man said. I worked the turbines here until 58. I live in the trailer behind the bait shop. I heard the door moan this afternoon. He walked to the desk and set down a heavy wool blanket and a thermos. He didn't ask why she was sleeping on a floor. He didn't ask where her family was. He simply uncapped the thermos and poured a cup of coffee. The steam smelled of chicory and burnt sugar. The station is restless tonight, Silas said. He tilted his head toward the floor. Can you hear it? Nora listened. Beneath the sound of the rain and the wind, there was something else, a low, rhythmic thrum. It wasn't the wind. It was a vibration that traveled through the soles of her feet. The turbines are dead, Silas, Nora said. They've been dead for decades. People say a lot of things are dead just because they stopped looking at them. Silas replied. He stood up and walked to the door. He paused and looked at the blue kettle on the desk. He gave a short, sharp nod. "Don't let the fire go out," he said. He vanished into the shadows of the main hall. Nora listened to his heavy boots on the concrete until the sound disappeared. She wrapped the wool blanket around herself and Barnaby. It smelled of cedar and wood smoke. She lay back down. The rain continued to fall. The leak in the roof continued to drip, but she didn't look at her phone again. She reached out and touched the cold iron of a pipe near the floor. The vibration was there. It was steady. It was a heartbeat. Nora gripped the wool blanket. She wasn't dead yet. She stood up. Nora Vance, 68 years old, woke to a silence that felt like a held breath. The rain had stopped. A single sliver of grey morning light cut through a hole in the roof and landed on the blue enameled kettle. The office was freezing. Her breath came out in a faint white cloud. She sat up slowly. Her joints made a sound like dry twigs snapping. Her lower back was a solid wall of pain. Barnaby was not on the top. The dog was standing in the center of the main hall. He was staring at a heavy iron hatch set into the concrete floor near the primary intake pipe. His ears were tucked back. He let out a low, vibrating growl that she felt in her own chest. Nora stood up and gripped her father's brass key. Her hands were trembling. She walked toward the dog. The thrumming vibration she had felt the night before was louder here. It wasn't a ghost. It was a mechanical pulse. It was steady. It was deep. She knelt by the hatch. The iron was cold enough to sting her skin. She saw a small keyhole hidden beneath a sliding brass cover. The cover was engraved with the same ivy leaf as her father's key. She slid the cover back. The metal was clean. It hadn't been touched by rust or time. Nora slid the brass master key into the hole. It turned without a sound. The hatch popped upward an inch. She hooked her fingers under the edge and pulled. The iron was heavy. She had to use her entire body weight to shift it. She gasped for air as the hatch swung open on greased hinges. A ladder led down into a sub-basement. She clicked on her flashlight and climbed down. The air changed. It didn't smell like mold or rot. It smelled of ozone and high-voltage electricity. She reached the bottom and stopped. Her heart hammered against her ribs. The sub-basement was a cathedral of modern technology. Behind a wall of reinforced glass, 3 massive turbines were spinning. They were silent but for a low, powerful hum. They weren't from 1912. They were stainless steel. They were digital. They were alive. LED lights flickered green on a control panel. "Arthur," she whispered. "What did you do?" She walked to a metal locker bolted to the wall. It was labeled Station 4, Legal and Grid Integration. She used the brass key again. Inside was a thick, leather-bound ledger and a sealed, waterproof envelope. Nora sat on a narrow metal stool. Her hands shook so violently she had to set the envelope on her knees to open it. She pulled out a stack of documents. She read the first page. Then she read it again. She wiped her eyes and read it a third time. The pumping station had never been decommissioned. In 1974, the city had entered a private-public partnership. The land remained private property. The machinery was leased to the regional power grid as a hydroelectric stabilizer. The lease stated that the owner of the land was entitled to 3% of the regional grid's transmission royalties. She turned the page. There was a bank statement from the municipal trust. It was dated last month. It was addressed to Nora Vance, successor in interest. She looked at the balance. She looked at the number of zeros. She counted them with her finger. She stopped breathing for a moment. The air in her lungs felt like ice. The account had been accumulating for 30 years. It had been shielded by a legacy trust that her father had designed to trigger only when the master key was used in this specific lock. The total was $4,872,000.14. Nora looked up at the spinning turbines. She looked at the green lights. She thought about Marcus. She thought about the suburban house and the blue velvet chair. She thought about the $42 in her bank account. She began to laugh. It was a small, dry sound that turned into a sob. She leaned her forehead against the cool glass of the turbine housing. "You were wrong, Marcus," she said to the empty room. "You were so very wrong." She stood up and tucked the envelope into her coat. She climbed back up the ladder. She closed the hatch and locked it. She stood in the center of the dusty, ruined hall and looked at the boarded windows. She didn't see the rot anymore. She didn't see the vines. She saw a fortress. She walked to the office and picked up her phone. She didn't look at the call history. She didn't check for messages. She walked to the front door and opened it. Silas was standing by the bait shop, watching the river. "Silas," Nora called out. Her voice was strong. It didn't waver. The old man turned. "The station is still pumping, Silas," she said. He gave a slow, knowing smile. "I know," he replied. Nora gripped the brass key around her neck. Everything had changed. The first royalty check arrived in a plain white envelope 3 weeks later. Nora sat at the scarred wooden desk and looked at the number. It was more than she had earned in 5 years at the city records office. She didn't buy a new car. She didn't buy a silk dress. She walked to the hardware store in town and bought a heavy-duty shop vacuum and 6 cases of industrial glass cleaner. The physical work was slow and punishing. Nora spent the first month on her knees with a wire brush and a bucket of muriatic acid. She scrubbed the soot of 50 years from the interior brickwork. Her hands grew calloused, and her fingernails were permanently stained with iron dust. Her back ached with a dull, grinding heat every evening. She didn't stop. She hired Silas to oversee the structural repairs. He didn't bring a large crew. He brought 2 retired masons who worked in silence. They replaced the rotted plywood with thick, tempered glass panels. They used copper flashing that caught the morning sun and turned the roofline into a crown of fire. They tuck-pointed the mortar until the walls looked like a single solid sheet of red earth. Nora spent her afternoons in the main hall. She polished the brass fittings on the old, inactive pumps until they shone like gold. She used a toothbrush to clean the grit from the gears of the overhead crane. She didn't hide the building's history. She scrubbed it until the history became the ornament. The transformation moved in layers. First, the smell of mold disappeared. It was replaced by the scent of linseed oil and beeswax. Then, the silence changed. The hollow, dead echo of an empty room was gone. It was replaced by the soft, rhythmic hum of the turbines beneath the floor. The property was no longer a ruin. It was an engine. She replaced the heavy iron front door with a custom-built oak entrance. It had a circular glass window etched with an ivy leaf. She planted native ferns and mosses along the riverbank. She cleared the rusted tires and the hemlock stalks. She replaced them with a gravel path that crunched musically underfoot. The moment the property became beautiful wasn't when the new windows went in. It happened on a Tuesday evening in late October. The sun hit the river at a low angle and reflected off the water. The light traveled through the high glass panels and hit the polished brass of the central pump. The entire room glowed with a deep, liquid amber light. The brass didn't just shine. It seemed to hold the warmth of the sun and radiate it back into the cold stone. Nora stood in the center of the hall and watched the light move across the floor. Barnaby lay on a new wool rug by the desk. He was no longer shivering. His coat was thick and shiny. He watched a single dust mote dance in a beam of light. Nora ran her hand over the smooth, restored brick of the wall. The stone felt warm. It felt solid. It felt like it had been waiting for her to come home and turn the lights back on. She looked at her reflection in the new glass. She was still 68 years old. Her hair was still silver. Her face was still mapped with the lines of her long journey. But she didn't look like a woman who had been erased. She looked like the woman who owned the heart of the city. The station was breathing. Nora realized she hadn't looked at her phone in 3 days. The realization came to her while she was sitting on the new stone bench by the river. She didn't feel the frantic need to check for a missed call or a text that would never come. The digital silence no longer felt like a vacuum. It felt like a choice. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the device. She scrolled past Marcus's name without a pause and opened the settings. She turned the ringer off and placed the phone face down on the stone. She stood up and walked back into the main hall. The afternoon sun was hitting the copper roof vents. It cast a warm, orange glow across the polished concrete floor. Nora walked to the sub-basement hatch and climbed down the ladder. The hum of the turbines was a physical presence here. It vibrated in her teeth and in the marrow of her bones. It was a constant, tireless reminder of a power that didn't need permission to exist. She stood before the glass wall and looked at the spinning steel. She felt a sudden, sharp loosening in her chest. It was as if a rusted bolt had finally given way. For 40 years, she had carried the weight of being a wife and a mother. She had defined herself by the depth of her sacrifices. Now, those roles felt like a coat that had grown too small. She was Nora Vance. She was the keeper of the grid, "I found the beat, Dad," she whispered to the empty room. She wasn't talking to a ghost. She was talking to the man who had seen this moment coming 30 years ago. She realized then that her father hadn't given her a ruin. He had given her a fortress, where she could finally stop being useful to everyone else and start being whole for herself. The tension in her shoulders, a knot she had carried since Marcus's law school graduation, simply dissolved. She breathed in the smell of ozone and felt the quiet. It was the first time in her life she didn't feel like she was waiting for someone else to tell her what to do next. People began to arrive at the end of the second month. They didn't come because of an advertisement. They came because word of the lady at the pumping station had moved through the bait shop and the local diner. A woman named Martha drove out from the village with a jar of blackberry preserves. She didn't offer Nora a pitying look. She asked if Nora needed help identifying the local birds. They sat on the riverbank and talked about the way the water changed color before a storm. A man named Thomas brought an old black and white photograph framed in cracked wood. It showed a group of men standing in front of the station in 1945. In the center was Nora's father, Arthur, holding the same brass key she now wore. Thomas didn't ask for a tour. He just wanted Nora to know that his own father had worked the night shift under Arthur. He told her the town felt safer now that the chimney was clean and the lights were on. Others brought small, practical things: a bag of heirloom seeds for the riverbank, a handmade wool rug for Barnaby, a collection of books on local history. They didn't treat Nora like a charity case or a lonely grandmother. They treated her like a neighbor. They treated her like an equal. They shared their own stories of loss and the quiet ways they had rebuilt their lives. One evening, Nora hosted a small gathering on the gravel path. Silas brought his accordion. Martha brought a crate of cider. They didn't talk about the city. They didn't talk about the people who had left them behind. They watched the river and listened to the steady, rhythmic pulse of the machinery beneath their feet. Nora sat on her stone bench and watched the light fade. She realized she had built more than a home. She had built a center of gravity. She looked at the ivy leaf etched into the glass of her door. It wasn't a symbol of the past anymore. It was a sign of what happens when a woman stops asking for a seat at the table and builds her own house instead. She felt the warmth of the sun-baked stone through her coat. She closed her eyes and listened to the water. She was at peace. A silver sedan pulled into the gravel drive on a Tuesday afternoon. The engine was quiet, but the tires made a sharp, aggressive sound against the stones. Nora was kneeling by the riverbank. She was planting a row of blue irises in the damp earth. She didn't look up when the car door opened. She knew the sound of that specific hinge. Marcus stepped out of the car. His polished leather shoes were immediately coated in a layer of fine grey dust. He looked at the restored brickwork of the station. He looked at the new copper gutters and the high glass panels. He didn't look at the river. He didn't look at his mother's face. "Mom, we've been so worried about you," Marcus said. He used his softest voice. It was the voice he used when he was trying to settle a difficult case out of court. He walked toward her with his hands held out, as if he were approaching a stray animal. Claire stayed by the car. She was looking at her reflection in the side mirror and adjusting her sunglasses. She didn't want to get her heels caught in the gravel. "You haven't called in 4 months, Marcus," Nora said. She didn't stand up. She continued to pack the dark soil around the base of a bulb. Her hands were steady. The dirt under her fingernails was a deep, honest black. Barnaby stood by her side. He didn't growl. He simply stared at Marcus with eyes that saw everything. "We've been busy with the new house, Mom. You know how it is," Marcus said. He stood 3 feet away from her. "But the city records office called my firm yesterday. They were looking for the successor in interest for the pumping station trust. They said the royalty payments are substantial." He paused. He waited for her to react. He waited for her to invite him inside for tea. When she remained silent, he took a step closer. "We're just being realistic, Mom," he added. "At your age, you can't be expected to manage a multi-million-dollar utility trust. There are tax implications. There are legal complexities you wouldn't understand. We're just thinking about what's best for everyone." Nora stood up slowly. She brushed the dirt from her apron. She was 68 years old, and she had never felt taller. She looked at her son. She saw the way his eyes darted to the sub-basement hatch. She saw the way he was already calculating the value of the copper on the roof. "I managed the city's records for 40 years, Marcus," Nora said. "I understand exactly how a trust works. I understand the math perfectly." Marcus adjusted his silk tie. His face flushed a dull, angry red. The caring mask began to slip. He looked at the station and then back at the silver car. "You shouldn't be so stubborn," Marcus said. His voice sharpened. "My firm needs the liquidity for the new merger. It's a waste to let that money sit in a damp basement when it could be working for the family. You're being selfish, Mom. You're sitting on a fortune while your own son is trying to build something." There it was. The truth had finally made it to the surface. It wasn't about her health. It wasn't about the stairs or the cold. It was about the merger. It was about the liquid asset she had become. "You gave me this station because you thought it was a tomb," Nora said. Her voice was quiet. It was as steady as the flow of the river behind her. She didn't raise her hand. She didn't point a finger. She simply spoke the words she had been holding since the day on the sidewalk. "You thought I was a burden you could bury in the weeds," she continued. "You thought this place was worthless because you couldn't see the power beneath the floor. You were wrong about both." Marcus opened his mouth to speak. He had a dozen arguments ready. He had a dozen ways to frame his greed as a virtue, but Nora didn't give him the chance to use them. "The gate at the end of the road is electronic now," Nora said. "I have the only code. I think you should leave before the timer resets." She turned her back on him. She knelt down and picked up her trowel. She began to dig the next hole for the next iris. She didn't listen to his footsteps on the gravel. She didn't listen to Claire complaining about the smell of the mud. The silver car reversed down the drive. The sound of the engine faded into the distance. Nora didn't look up until the silence of the river returned. She reached out and patted Barnaby on the head. "He was always bad at the long game," she whispered. The door clicked shut. 1 year after the morning she arrived at the edge of the river with a single suitcase, Nora Vance stood on the new cedar pier. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and the sharp, clean perfume of the blue irises she had planted. They were in full bloom now. Their petals were the exact shade of the summer sky. The heavy Victorian brick of the pumping station glowed in the early light. The copper gutters had begun to take on a deep, weathered patina. The building no longer looked like a tomb. It looked like a sentinel. Nora walked back toward the station. Her limp was gone. Her movements were fluid and deliberate. She didn't move like a woman who was waiting for the end. She moved like a woman who had a schedule to keep. She entered the main hall and felt the familiar, grounding vibration of the turbines beneath the floor. It was a sound that had become the soundtrack of her life. It was the rhythm of the city's heart, and it was steady. She went to the small office and picked up the blue enameled kettle. She filled it with water from the new filtration tap. She set it on the small electric stove she had installed in the corner. The whistle of the kettle was the only signal she needed to start her day. She made a pot of tea and set out 2 mismatched porcelain cups. One was for her, the other was for Silas. He would be arriving soon from his trailer to check the pressure gauges on the upper pipes. The morning mail sat on the corner of the desk. There were 3 letters from the local historical society. They wanted to include the station on the summer walking tour. There was a thank you note from a student at the local high school. The girl had received the first Arthur Vance engineering scholarship, funded by the station's surplus royalties. Nora didn't read the letters with pride. She read them with a quiet sense of utility. She had spent 40 years filing the city's past. Now, she was building its future. She reached up and touched the heavy brass master key around her neck. It was no longer dark with grime and old grease. She had polished it until it gleamed like a piece of jewelry. The notches were sharp. The ivy leaf engraving was clear. It was no longer a weight she carried. It was the tool that had unlocked her own life. She remembered the day Marcus had pressed it into her palm. He had thought he was giving her a piece of junk. He had thought he was closing a door. She realized she hadn't thought about Marcus in months. She didn't know where he was living. She didn't know if the merger had been a success or a failure. The anger she had felt on the sidewalk had evaporated like morning mist. It hadn't been replaced by forgiveness. It had been replaced by something much more powerful, indifference. He was a person from a story she was no longer reading. She had retired from being his mother, just as she had retired from the city records office. Barnaby sat by the open door. He was watching a heron land on a partially submerged log in the river. The dog was grey and stiff in the joints, but his eyes were bright. He was well fed and warm. He was the first one to hear the crunch of gravel as Silas arrived. The old man walked into the hall and tipped his cap. He didn't say good morning. He just took his cup of tea and pointed toward the sub-basement hatch. "The grid load is heavy today," Silas said. "Then we'd better make sure we're ready," Nora replied. They spent the morning in the quiet companionship of work. They checked the oil levels in the old brass fittings. They wiped the condensation from the high glass panels. They listened to the hum of the turbines. Nora felt the vibration traveling through her shoes. She felt it in her hands as she touched the iron pipes. It was a conversation that never ended. It was the city telling her that it was still breathing. At noon, Nora walked out to the very edge of the pier. She looked back at the station. It was a massive, beautiful machine of brick and glass. It was a monument to the things that last. She looked down at the brass key in her hand and squeezed the metal. She looked out at the moving water of the river. It was headed toward the center of the city. It was carrying the power she was generating. "You were right, Dad," Nora whispered to the wind. "The heart never stops." She stayed on the pier for a long time. She didn't check her watch. She didn't check her phone. She just watched the water. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. The evening sun settled behind the ridge, and the light through the high glass panels turned the brass pumps into columns of soft gold. Nora Vance, 68 years old, sat at her father's desk and listened to the steady, deep hum of the floorboards beneath her feet. She reached out and touched the brass master key one last time. She unhooked the leather lanyard from her neck and hung the key on a permanent brass peg beside the office door. It wasn't a weight she needed to carry anymore. It was a part of the house. She looked out the window at the garden she had built with her own hands. The blue irises were closing for the night. The river was a dark ribbon of moving silk that carried the reflection of the rising moon. She thought about the suburban house with its manicured lawn and its empty rooms. She thought about the blue velvet chair and the polished oak table. They felt like objects from a story she had read a long time ago. She realized she hadn't lost anything of value on that sidewalk. She had simply traded a cage for a kingdom. She picked up her blue enameled kettle and poured the last of the hot water into her cup. The steam smelled of peppermint and home. She stepped out onto the cedar pier with Barnaby at her side. The dog's tail made a soft, rhythmic thumping sound against the wood. In the distance, the lights of the city began to flicker on one by one. Thousands of tiny white stars were drawing their power from the turbines spinning in the darkness beneath her feet. She was no longer the woman who filed the records of the city's past. She was the energy that kept its future from going dark. She looked at the reflection of the pumping station in the water. It looked solid. It looked eternal. She felt the vibration of the grid in the soles of her feet. It was a heartbeat that would never stop as long as she was there to tend the fire. "We're doing just fine, Dad," Nora whispered to the river. She sat on the stone bench and watched the first real stars appear in the sky. She felt the warmth of the day's sun still radiating from the stone. She wasn't waiting for a phone call. She wasn't waiting for an apology. She was simply there. Nora's journey is a reminder that the world often mistakes quietness for weakness. It proves that the people who spend their lives building foundations for others, are the only ones who truly know how to survive when the walls come down. If Nora's story moved you, if you've ever felt that your years of sacrifice were being treated like a debt that would never be repaid, your strength is seen. Leave one word in the comments describing how you felt when Nora finally stood on her own pier and looked at the lights of the city. Because Nora's story proves something that is always true. Your value is not a number in a bank account or a line in a legal document. Your value is the power you carry in your own heart and the legacy you refuse to let anyone else define. Share this with someone who needs to remember that it is never, ever too late to reclaim the life they were told they had to give away. Because together, we prove that dreams don't age.